In the start of what could become a new series, depending on how you folks on the channel enjoy it, this is an example of how manufacturers can produce cars which are simultaneously so badass, but also which you may have never even heard of. In this video, we're turning our attention to Volkswagen, and we're also talking about race cars, rally, concept, even production vehicles, some one-offs in there as well. All of them, though, share one thing in common, and that is that they're pretty damn cool. So if your idea of a rare Volkswagen is something along the lines of a Beetle RSI, or perhaps a Golf GTi Edition 30, then some of these are probably going to blow your mind. And even though I've put 15 in the title, you're actually going to get more than that, so stick around for those bonus mentions. First up, we have the Golf Rally. This is one which, of course, the homologation era fans will definitely be familiar with, based on the second generation Golf in particular. This was a supercharged 1.8 litre Group A rally homologated version, which ironically, given that it weighed nearly 1200 kilos, wasn't really that much quicker than a Golf GTi at the time, despite how badass it looks. It's always struck me as kind of a BMW M3 if it were a hatchback kind of look, and with 160 horsepower from that supercharged engine, it is still a pretty cool car which, thanks to its rarity, is worth quite a lot these days. One of the most unique things about the car compared to the GTi was actually its non-permanent four-wheel drive, which, thanks to a viscous coupling in the centre, would allow for more traction if the car detected it wasn't getting enough over the front. For the next one, we are turning to the world of concepts though, with the Volkswagen Eco Racer. This is one of the cars which always pops to mind for me when I think of really cool concepts from Volkswagen that just never had the chance to shine. This very cute looking concept car was shown in 2005 and has a diesel engine. A diesel sports car isn't the most obvious thing in the world, but Volkswagen did play with the idea more than a few times, and this one had so much promise, not least of which because of how good it looked. But with a 140 horsepower engine, it was a lot better than you might think. 0 to 60 in 6.3 seconds, and at the same time 70 miles to the gallon. With a 7-speed DSG gearbox, this would have been a very impressive car, and if they had produced it, I think it would have been very popular. Speaking of wacky concepts, this next one looks far crazier, and yet, from what we can ascertain, got closer to actually reaching production than the Eco Racer did, and that's the GX3. This was shown in 2006. I remember first seeing this one in an old issue of Top Gear magazine. It was actually powered by a Lupo GTi engine, and of course the biggest claim to fame for this car in terms of gimmicks was its three-wheel layout, with power going, of course, to the rear, Grinnell Scorpion style. Now this one had a 6-speed manual gearbox, weighed not very much at all, to give it a technical term, and had a 0 to 60 time of 5.7 seconds. And Lotus actually helped to develop the chassis with Volkswagen on this car. In fact, Volkswagen went so far as to say that if there was enough public interest, they may potentially produce this for around $17,000. Why then don't you see GX3s zipping about on the streets? Well, unfortunately, because as you would expect, when Volkswagen actually looked into developing it for any kind of production run, the costs associated with it, especially on a smaller run, meant that there was no chance they could ever make it a $17,000 car. Combined with some of the visual changes that would have been necessary, unfortunately made it a lot less desirable to that market than it originally would have been. The next one definitely has a special place for me, the Volkswagen Touareg W12 Sport. Some of you will definitely be familiar with this car. I actually find this one fascinating, not for the reasons that most people do. See, this is the ultimate Touareg. Most people think that it's the R50 with the V10 diesel engine. This is way beyond any diesel V10. This is powered by the same 6-litre W12 petrol engine that you will find in a Bentley Continental or a Flying Spur, with one key difference: no turbos. This car does not have 550 horsepower as those first generation Bentleys did, it has about 450 instead. And what that meant in practice is that back in the early 2000s, even with that naturally aspirated engine, this thing could hit 60 miles an hour in about 5.8 seconds, which for a nearly 3-ton SUV in the relatively early days of performance SUVs on the market, that was a big deal. Now, only 500 of these were ever produced. You occasionally see them come up for sale. All of them are left-hand drive, drive, and although they sound fantastic, and I believe it even shares the same starter motor as a Bugatti Veyron, I believe there's one key reason why this car never had its turbos, and although this is only a theory, I think it's kind of a wild one. See, if this car had had those twin turbos and was putting out that 552 horsepower of Bentley level performance, it would have completely overshadowed the Porsche Cayenne Turbo and even the 520 horsepower Turbo S. The reason why I think the car didn't have the turbos is because of that exact scenario. Volkswagen of course owns Porsche. The Cayenne was the single most important Porsche of the early 2000s and plays a big reason as to why Porsche is so successful now. And if a Touareg, which of course was already based on the same platform as the Cayenne, had come along and blown the top of the range Porsche out of the water, which it would have with that engine in terms of both how exotic it was and how fast it was, I think it would have killed Porsche in their tracks. Volkswagen of course didn't want that, and that's my personal theory on why this car ended up not having turbos. The next one is wild because the vehicle which it's already based on is exceedingly rare, and although you can buy them for up around 100 grand when you see them occasionally on Auto Trader, it's not exactly the kind of car which you would put hand in hand with performance. It's called the XL1, which some of you again will be familiar with. It's a Volkswagen super economy vehicle, ultra aerodynamic, tiny engine, crazy good fuel economy, but very expensive because of its development and ultra low production. This one though is the XL1 Sport, and Volkswagen owns, among many other things, Ducati, so they decided to celebrate selling 200 million cars by building a sport version of the XL1 with an 1199 Superleggera Ducati V-twin engine, 200 horsepower superbike powered sports car. And even though combining the idea of an eco car with a superbike engine doesn't make too much sense on the surface, when you look into it more, it actually kind of does, because that engine puts out 200 horsepower, revs to 12,000 RPM, and in a car that only weighs 890 kilos, and crucially has the aerodynamics to achieve that kind of fuel economy, the results were actually astronomical. It was a working vehicle. Volkswagen engineers and heads have driven it and have said it's incredibly fun to drive, and even though the 0 to 60 time might not be as quick as you might think at about 5.7 seconds, the top speed is phenomenal, about 170 miles an hour. The next one will definitely be familiar to any fans who may be from Brazil, the Volkswagen SP2, what some consider to be one of the prettiest Volkswagens ever made. This was, as I said, a Volkswagen Brazil vehicle. There are a number of unique Volkswagen Brazil models, some of which are very, very popular in Europe as imported cult classics. I'm really shocked though that you don't see more SP2s over here, because they actually built about 10,000 of these between 1972 and 1975. It's based on the Type 3 chassis, also Brazilian market, and it has the usual fare when it comes to mechanicals: rear engine, rear wheel drive, air cooled, 1.6 or 1.7 litres with a 4-speed manual. The real selling point here of course is those looks, and with 10,000 of them made, I really am shocked that you don't see at least a few of these showing up at car shows in Europe. I'm sure there are some, but if you lived in Brazil and had these great looking things around, you probably wouldn't want to export too many of them. The next one isn't as pretty, isn't as interesting. In fact, it's probably one of the more boring ones on the list for many people, but for those of us who love Volkswagen's luxury cars, this really was a sad occasion. It's the Phaeton, but not a Phaeton that you've probably seen before. This was the Phaeton D2 concept, and this was a non-produced third generation, if you will, of the Phaeton. We had the originals, which even came with that crazy V10 diesel engine, and of course the W12. Then we had the facelift. This was going to be a new generation of Phaeton. Unfortunately, Volkswagen didn't pursue it, and again, I feel like a lot of their decisions are so that they don't overshadow the value for money, sales in other words, from their other brands, and of course, since they own Bentley, they wouldn't really want to step on their toes again. Plus, it wasn't exactly like the Phaeton was a huge success the first time around. The next one jumps back to the very first car that we talked about, at least in spirit, and this one some of you will definitely recognize, the Volkswagen Golf A59 Rally. This was a one-off vehicle designed and intended for top-tier rally homologation, and it was a beast. A 2-litre turbo with 86 by 86 mil bore and stroke. It had a form of all-wheel drive which kind of predated in the early 90s what would later become the Haldex style 4-wheel drive, which you'll commonly see on stuff like the Golf R32. It had a carbon Kevlar body, integrated roll cage, bucket seats, and even 2 275 horsepower with 273 foot-pounds of torque. Again, in the early 90s, that was a big deal. That's way beyond something like an Audi Quattro 20-valve, which had about 220 horsepower. Even the Delta Evo 2 had up around 220 horsepower. This thing would have been an absolute monster, and apparently it could even hit 60 miles an hour in just under 5 seconds. What a beast. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it never quite got the chance to compete, but you can guarantee if this had had a limited production run like those other cars that I mentioned, this would be at least as in demand for collectors as stuff like your Audi Quattros, Lancia Deltas, and others. The next one, to be honest, barely even should be allowed on the list, but I had to mention it because it's one of my favourite vehicles ever to feature a Volkswagen badge, of course, because I'm such a huge fan of Le Mans. I love prototype racing, and this is a car which I guarantee many of you have not heard of because it's not even technically a Volkswagen. The Volkswagen 2KQ, a Volkswagen Le Mans car? Well, kind of. It's actually a Reynard 2KQ LM chassis. These raced from around 2001 to 2003, but the reason why it's on the list is not only because it's one of the very few times, if ever, you could find a Volkswagen badge on a Le Mans vehicle, but also it is powered by a Volkswagen engine, a 2-litre straight-four turbo, which is wildly different to the engines which these chassis usually have, which have even included stuff like V10s from Judd. Is it a proper Volkswagen? Well, not in the sense of the others on the list, but you've got to admit, something that's Volkswagen powered with a Volkswagen badge being in the 24-hour race multiple times, successful or not, that's pretty awesome. The next one is a car which until very recently I had no idea even existed, a Polo R WRC edition. This one was never produced in right-hand drive form, and it takes what was the GTi Polo way further. This is more of a modern idea of a WRC homologation car, and it takes the horsepower far higher as well, up around 220. Apparently these are a bit of a handful to drive, which isn't too surprising given that it does not have four-wheel drive to help it, but what a cool little car. I almost wish it looked a bit more special other than just what is a slightly revised front bumper and a couple of, well, stripes in effect, but still very cool that it exists at all, and certainly a car which I would love to get my hands on to drive. The next few are actually consolidated together into one vehicle in effect, even though this is where you're really getting your bonuses in, because I'm combining 4 cars into one position on the list, because back in the earlier to mid 2000s, Volkswagen teamed up with a couple of different tuning companies and tuning houses to build some SEMA show cars. These were intended to show the kind of tuning capabilities of their cars and to get a younger demographic involved in purchasing said vehicles. And not just younger people, but a lot of that was clearly inspired here. What that resulted in was a plethora of vehicles, including those built by none other than HPA Motorsports, who will of course be familiar to Gran Turismo players, and it included a Jetta RGT, which looks bonkers, a 575 horsepower Passat RGT, which looks absolutely stunning with that matte black grille and white body, a Golf R GTi, which was not built by HPA. I seem to recall that was AEM, I think it was, which was in other words a 375 horsepower Golf, which looks absolutely stunning as well, and even a version of the Touareg, which turned it into an RGT. And I hadn't even realised for many years that when you look up the Volkswagen V10 or W12 on Google, you're actually inadvertently looking at this car, even though you didn't realise it. It's that silver one on Google, pictured in the desert with kind of a body kit going on. Well, apparently that is the RGT show car. The next one is also a 2-for-1 deal because its spirit lies earlier on in a 2003 concept called the Concept R. This was a great looking little car, very clearly the Porsche Boxster school of motoring, with what appears to be a VR6 power plant, tuned up to 260 horsepower, a 3.2 V6. 0 to 60 would have been fantastic on that thing, no doubt, with that lovely petrol engine. Again, I think it goes back to the thing of not wanting to step on Porsche's toes. This one came later on though, which is called the Blue Sport in 2009. Much more modernised look. They did away with, unfortunately, the V6 engine, and more expectedly a 2-litre TDI. 0 to 60 would have still been just over 6 seconds though, pretty lightweight, with again a DSG gearbox, mid-engine rear-wheel drive, and doubtless very good fuel economy. Either of these I think would have been a lovely production car, and if you think about it, if they'd have made even just the open top, but certainly a hard top version, it would have have given something like a Toyota 86 or a Subaru BRZ a great run for its money in that segment. The next one jumps back to the Phaeton D2 kind of idea, wherein it's not necessarily the most exciting of vehicles on paper, but more so what it represented in terms of being ahead of its time and what could have been. This is the 1989 Volkswagen Futura, a pretty wacky looking car, especially given its age. This is a futuristic looking thing even now, and it came out, as I said, in '89. It had some interesting ideas, relatively normal and not particularly powerful 1.7 litre petrol engine, but it also had a radiatorless evaporation based cooling system, which was quite a cool idea, and it was such an inspiration that when you fast forward around 30 years, when Volkswagen unveiled the ID3 concept, it was finished in this same kind of colour scheme. So clearly they kept the car in mind, and even its design looked so far ahead of its time that you can kind of see those cues in the ID3, which is pretty awesome. The next one I'm not going to dwell on for too long because I know electric cars don't have a huge amount of fans, but to me one of the reasons why they don't is because many of them are just so boring. Many manufacturers go down the lazy route as far as aerodynamics and design. You could easily make these cars far more appealing to look at, and for a variety of reasons they just don't. Volkswagen almost did that, even though this is squarely in the concept side of things, with the IDX Performance, a 2023 concept super saloon with 550 horsepower. Some would say it looks a bit over the top. I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but the idea is a very cool one. And last but definitely not least, we have the Volkswagen Touareg. No, that's not a typo, it's not a Touareg, it's something else entirely, with some similarities to certain versions of the Touareg which raced in Dakar, of all things. This is the 2003 Volkswagen Touareg. Looks almost like a sports car, maybe a mini or baby W12 Nardo that was jacked up and put on off-road suspension. This one actually did compete though, and even finished 6th in the 2003 Dakar Rally. It's actually a fascinating car in terms of its spec sheet though, because it only weighs 1,200 kilos, had a huge 250 litre endurance fuel tank, no surprise there, but also combined with that massive tank, a 220 horsepower TDI engine. You combine that kind of economy with that size fuel tank, you've got yourself a pretty great winning formula. And even though it didn't win, 6th place in Dakar is not bad at all. So ultimately that's it for my pick of technically 15, but in reality you got plenty of bonuses in there as well, probably more like 20 vehicles overall, and Volkswagen has so many cool cars, many of which you've seen here, that you really could go on all day. So if you think there are some that I've missed, certainly foreign market stuff like Brazil, maybe the Volkswagen Type 181 thing, and various others too, then of course drop those down in the comments. And absolutely, if this is something that you'd like to see me do more of with different manufacturers, then of course I would be interested in doing that too. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, thanks for watching.